Welcome everyone to Global Pills. This is Giovanni Gruni. There has been a lot of discussion in the news about free trade agreements concluded by the European Union and how they affect the food we eat. You might have heard, for instance, of acronyms like CETA and issues such as chlorinated chicken or carcinogenic growth hormones in meat. But do European Union's free trade agreements make our food less safe? We discuss this today with Emily Rees, Senior Fellow at the European Centre for International Political Economy and founder of Trade Strategies, a trade and regulatory advisory consultancy. Emily comes from an extensive career in trade policy and economic diplomacy. She served as Trade Attaché of France to Brazil and led Brazil's trade and investment agency with the European Union. Welcome to Global Pills, Emily.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, Emily, what is a free trade agreement?
So, a free trade agreement is essentially a pact between two or more countries to reduce tariffs and barriers to imports and exports among them. But I do prefer to call these agreements preferential trade agreements rather than free trade agreements, as today's trade deals tend to focus more on rule setting than on tariffs. But we can get back to that soon. Their objective is essentially to facilitate trade between the signing countries to the benefit of both economies. So preferential trade agreements can also be used to add extra rules, for instance, in the area of environment or labor standards, to make trade fairer. That's why I like to call them preferential trade agreements.
Why is the European Union negotiating free trade agreements on behalf of European Union's member states? Why Spain, France, or Germany, for instance, are not negotiating them on their own?
Now, that's a great question. And perhaps it's worth rewinding a bit in history to explain this. So, EU trade policy started in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome that granted the European Economic Community of the time exclusive competence for common commercial policy. The Common Customs Union was established a little bit later in 1968, and that was the key turning point. The six member countries that formed the initial ECC lifted all customs duties and trade restrictions amongst each other. And then from there on, they were able to replace their national customs duties with a common one on all products that were coming from the rest of the world. And this is essentially how countries started pooling their ability to negotiate. So to your question, why doesn't Spain, France, or Germany negotiate on their own? Well, because they have little incentive to do so, to be fair. Together, they have a lot more power in negotiating better trade preferences with the rest of the world. And in a way, that's exactly what the United Kingdom is now discovering. It doesn't mean that these countries don't input into the process. They do. And firmly sometimes in the meetings of the EU Council, so with the 27 member states, that's where they input into the process, but they allow the Commission to drive the negotiations. They trust the Commission to negotiate the best deal for them all. And so far, it's been a successful strategy.
What is the point of negotiating these free trade agreements if there is already the World Trade Organization?
So most barriers to trade today aren't tariffs, but differences in regulations and standards that act as barriers to trade. The World Trade Organization is a member-driven organization that operates a system of trade rules which have been agreed to by all members. And so unless all countries agree to the rules, this is why they can stay pretty basic. And to be fair, we're seeing the limits of this in many areas already, be it in digital trade or in environmental impact of trade policy, for instance. So WTO members haven't always managed to make progress altogether to advance international rules. And that's why, a number of countries have looked to these preferential trade agreements in a new light. Negotiations have slightly stalled in the WTO. So the purpose of these free trade agreements really is to go beyond WTO rules, but while keeping in line with the basic ones which have been set to by all members. That's often why they're referred to as 21st century agreements.
So, what are the most impactful free trade agreements the European Union has concluded recently?
The EU has trade agreements with well over 50 countries around the world. And all preferential trade agreements are impactful in their own right. But amongst the most recent trade deals negotiated by the EU, we've got some which are quite substantial. On the latest pipeline, we have EU Mercosur, that's with the South American countries of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. EU Japan, which is also a significant agreement, and the agreement with Canada called CETA.
Let's move the focus more towards trade in food. Are these free trade agreements relevant for food and agricultural products?
So, food, plants, and animals count amongst the products which are probably the most highly regulated products in the world, alongside pharmaceuticals and chemicals. And there's a very good reason for this. There is public health concerns, and that's obviously very relevant when we're trading these products. Now, every country in the world has a very different view on the risks relating to food and agriculture, because it has very different risks relating to food and agriculture. What are we talking about when we're talking about risks in this area? We're talking about animal diseases or plant pests. So the first rule of thumb in the trade of agricultural products is to make sure that you're not introducing a new disease or a pest into your territory that could devastate your own production, right? That's really the starting point. So what trade agreements do is they help organize these types of issues, because, as we discussed, preferential agreements are really all about tackling regulatory barriers to find common ground that benefit both sides. But food is also about consumers, right? Japanese, Canadian, and European consumers don't share the same tastes, habits, or have the same rules in place to ensure that food is safe to be eaten. Yet, I don't know about you, but I love food from other places in the world, and I'm really happy when I can get to taste them. So it's about really making that bridge. So to keep it simple, a preferential trade agreement asks you to assess whether you trust your partner's food to be as safe as your own, right? But it doesn't change the rules that you have in place.
Why some people think world trade rules affect the safety of the food we eat then?
Well, world trade rules do affect the safety of the food we eat, but probably not in the way people would expect. Uh, the reason here is that most people believe that their rules are the best. And this is the same in the whole world. And needless to say that this is often wrong. No country has five-star rules for all foods. They generally tend to have higher than average rules for the food that they produce more of, or where they've actually confronted a significant crisis in the past. So take, for example, the EU's precautionary principle. That's the principle that underlies most of today's food safety rules in Europe. Now, the precautionary principle allows decision makers to adopt precautionary measures even when the scientific evidence about the environmental or human health hazard is somewhat uncertain. Now, philosophically, to some, the precautionary principle is totally unscientific, it's an obstacle to process. And then for others, it's essential to protect human health and the environment. So it's about drawing a line, right? But I think that what's interesting is, again, how did the precautionary principle really emerge in European food safety? It actually emerged from a huge food safety scandal. I don't know if you remember the BSE crisis or Mads cow disease. That stemmed from a practice whereby farmers had been feeding animal protein meal to cows that are ruminants. This unnatural cattle cannibalism created a disease that cost people their lives and was really scary. So obviously, most people in the world immediately banned EU beef at the time from being imported. and the EU changed its rules. So not only was the practice banned in Europe, but it triggered a long tradition of caution, if not over caution in the European Union. And obviously, other parts of the world who didn't live through that crisis will not particularly understand why the EU is now so afraid of innovation, even when science indicates that there is no risk. So when we look at food safety generally, I think it's always very important to consider what science says as the starting point, but also be mindful of the history behind each country's rules, your own and those of others. They often have a very deep rooting.
So there are international rules affecting food.
Yes, the main international standard setting body for food trade is a UN agency, and it's called Codex Alimentarius. It's the baseline rulebook to which all countries agreed, and they're the ones that are accepted by the World Trade Organization in any case relating to food safety. The thing is that when it comes to food safety rules, countries are allowed to impose rules that are stricter than Codex if they're able to prove that there is some kind of risk to human health. And this should be based on science, but as we discussed in the case of the EU and the precautionary principle, that's not always the case.
So it seems from what you say that the European Union is negotiating these free trade agreements because it thinks it can extract more benefits with them from other countries. What was the European Union trying to achieve with regard to trading food in the negotiations with Japan and Canada, and has the European Union achieved it?
Well, of course, we negotiate trade deals to gain benefits. That's the main point, but it's not the only one. So we also use these FTAs to place provisions on other aspects of trade, such as environmental protection, now, for instance, by including the Paris Climate Agreement, and also protecting labor rights. So the EU is one of the world's largest agri-food producers and exporters. So when it's negotiating a trade deal, it's obviously looking to improve its own market access of food, which it produced competitively into another's market, and to protect its market from the foods which the partner produces more competitively than itself, right? So in the cases of the agreements with Canada and Japan, the EU pushed very strong to get good trading terms for what it's successful in. For instance, cheese and wine, whereas Canada definitely wanted to sell its wheat to Europe, particularly to the Italians, to make pasta. In this sense, EU negotiators were indeed very successful in these deals. It's always about a quid pro quo that is a win-win.
I suppose geographical indications come into the picture here.
Yeah, well, yes. So a geographical indication is essentially it's a sign used on products that have a specific geographical origin and that have qualities or a reputation that is due to that specific origin. They are foods with a clear link to the original place of production. And let's just say that the European Union is rather fond of them. The sales value of a product that has a protected name is on average the double of the similar product without this certification. So for the EU, obviously, putting these GIs, these geographical indications, into free trade agreements is extremely important also in terms of getting good value for them on the international market. Just to give you an idea, the EU exports around 15 billion euros of GI foods every single year. That's significant not only for the heritage and traditions of these foods, but also because they're very job creating in less populated, more rural areas of Europe. These FTAs don't only provide an opportunity to protect the European GIs in the export market and provide sort of market access for them. But here's the thing, by getting these geographical indications into free trade agreements, the EU is also expanding its own logic of food onto the world. It's really the Brussels effect, if you wish. And in that sense, it's also been very successful.
Do CETA and the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement impact the way the European Union and its member states can take precautionary measures to protect the safety of the food we eat?
So, trade agreements can do a bit, but they can't do everything. Trade agreements are not here to change the way we make our rules or the principles upon which our rules are built, right? So, similarly, it's not because you have a FTA that you can't raise a dispute in the WTO, right? So, generally, the point is more about creating a point of dialogue in which areas that are considered a bit sensitive between countries can be discussed, and they can be discussed in a more collaborative format. So it's not because Canada and Japan have a trade deal with the EU that they like or accept the precautionary principle. The EU will still need to justify measures with scientific backing if it wants to prohibit the entry of products from those countries using that principle.
Let's look at South America now. The European Union has recently concluded free trade agreements there as well, right?
Yeah, the EU recently reached an agreement in principle with Mercosur. So, again, that's the customs union that unites Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It's also concluded a pretty interesting modernization of its agreement with Mexico. These are really geopolitical agreements in what they say about the EU's relation to the world. And I believe that, this connection to Latin America has a lot that can still be done. And these trade agreements definitely help. Now, both of these agreements still need to be ratified by the member states and the European Parliament to enter into force. So we're just at the first stages. But I think it's a good news.
Do what you said about CETA with Canada and the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement apply to these South American free trade agreements as well?
Yes, on the whole, yes, with a slight exception for Mexico. In the modernization of the free trade agreement with Mexico, the EU managed to convince Mexico to accept the precautionary principle for sanitary and phytosanitary provisions. That's all the rules for animals, plants, feed, and food. Essentially, that would make any dispute from Mexico against the EU on the basis of a scientific measure a lot more difficult. So for the EU, that was a very big win. For the moment, it's the only country that has accepted that in the world.
Thank you very much, Emily, for your expertise. We conclude the podcast asking our guest what is, in their opinion, the number one challenge in their area of interest.
There are many challenges in the area of food trade, but right now I'm focused on analyzing how the COVID-19 pandemic will change rules at the international level. What we're seeing is a better need to integrate what's known as the One Health principle into international trade and international trade rules. The One Health principle is the interface between humans, animals, and ecosystems, which is obviously key to any food system and to any food production and therefore to food trade. And now that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is set to undergo substantial reform, I really hope these topics start to gain traction. So that's what I'm looking into.
Are there ways our listeners can get in touch with you if they want to know more?
Sure, you can follow me on Twitter at Emily Rees in one word _EU. It's always a pleasure to discuss trade and food, be it on a podcast or on Twitter. And Giovanni, thanks for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Many thanks for your participation, Emily. Thank you for listening, Global Pills. If you like this episode, please click subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all main podcasting platforms. You can get in touch with me or propose yourself as a guest, sending a mail to globalpillspodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter @globalpillspod, on Instagram @GroonyGlobal, Facebook, and LinkedIn.